the sort of standard examples of items of knowledge, justified belief that are taken to be a priori are claims, principles, rules of logic, mathematics, conceptual truths like all bachelors are unmarried men, right? Logic, mathematics are usually held up as being the a priori disciplines, the sort of paradigmatic a priori disciplines. But you'll also find some principles of metaphysics or maybe ethics, possibly epistemology, where the thought is that we might know some of these claims or principles in an a priori way. Need to characterize the distinction that's underlying this quite specifically. We distinguish between the a priori and the a posteriori, and what's usually meant by the claim that we can know something a posteriori is that there may be a proposition or a belief, and it can be known on the basis of experience. A posteriori knowledge is knowledge that we're acquiring by means of observation in an empirical way, drawing from experience. And that contrasts with the a priori. A proposition that is known in an a priori way is known without using experience. It's known independently of experience. It's known by thought alone, rather than by drawing upon experience. Here's some examples that Limos gives of a priori knowledge. These are things you ought to be able to know without having to make an observation to determine whether they're true or not. So all swans are swans. You don't need to check each swan to see whether it's a swan. You don't need empirical evidence for that. It's just clear that all swans are swans. All squares are rectangles. There's going to be a definition of rectangle such that a square satisfies that definition. So a square is going to be a rectangle. Whatever's red is colored, right? Well, it's in the nature of being red that it's a color. So if something is red, then it's got a color. It's colored. 7 plus 5 equals 12. Thought is, you know that's true, not by experience, but a priori, independently of experience, by pure thought alone. And if some men are Greeks, then some Greeks are men. So this is just a little bit of reasoning. If you can see that there's some men who are Greeks, well, there's some men who are Greeks, and some of the Greeks have got to be men, right? Pretty obvious. But you don't need empirical evidence for that. That's something you can know a priori. And then some of Limos's examples of the a posteriori. Right? We saw all swans are swans was known a priori. All swans weigh under 40 pounds. That would be an empirical claim. That swans do not weigh more than 40 pounds. It's just something you have to find out by experience. There are at least 6 red things on the desk. Well, I suppose that's the desk. I only see none, actually, right? I needed to use some empirical, some observation to determine whether that was true or false, right? So that's known a posteriori. It's known, in fact, if this is the desk, it's known to be false by experience a posteriori. Nick is a Greek. Well, Nick could have been anything. We had to find out that he was a Greek. And I have a headache. Well, I don't actually, luckily. But I would, if it were true, it would be, or if I found out that it was true, it would be by experience. I'd be having the experience of having a headache. That would show me that that claim is true. Right? So these are cases that should sort of get across the rough contrast. And the thought about a priori knowledge is that no experience is needed in order to show or to find out that items of a priori knowledge are true. Right? In order to find out that something is true, if it's something that's knowable a priori, you don't need experience. You don't need to make observations. You don't need experiments. You just think. Those examples, you can just consider them, and you'll realize that they're true. You think about them. Sometimes it's said that they're self-evident. And this is the difference between the a priori and the a posteriori. That which is a priori, experience is not needed to see that they're true. You think, you reflect upon them, to consider them, and you recognize that they're true. You don't need experience. By contrast, with an empirical, with an a posteriori case, we're going to need some evidence. We're going to need to make an observation. We will need empirical evidence. So are there 6 red items on the desk? You have to look or feel or some other way get access to information about what's on the desk. It's an empirical matter, and that's in the nature of a posteriori knowledge. You can't just think, reason without access to any information, and come up with a correct answer to how many red items are on top of the desk. You need experience for that. Now, with what's known a priori, Limos makes a distinction between basic and non-basic a priori knowledge. There are going to be some items of knowledge which we can acquire, which we can have a priori in a sort of immediate way because we can just recognize them. But there are going to be others that we have to sort of work for. We're going to have to reason for them. We're going to have to conduct an argument. But this can still be a priori, right? We could start with some basic a priori knowledge, and then we can conduct an argument. We can reason through without drawing on any empirical information and show that something else is the case. That would be non-basic a priori knowledge. And the thought is that when you have a proof of a mathematical theorem, you're going to be proving it in an a priori way, but it will be non-basic because you'll have proven it based on something else. It'll still be a priori, even though it wasn't something you recognized just immediately to be true. Question is, this so-called or apparent knowledge that we're capable, or some people think we're able to have, independent of experience, is a priori knowledge. The question is, where does it come from? Seems pretty obvious how we have knowledge of an a posteriori nature. We're trying to figure out answers to questions that need an empirical answer. We use our experience. We use our senses to find out these kind of things. But where does knowledge come from if it's a priori? Limos offers a couple of sort of standard takes on this. And the sort of standard way is to think that a priori knowledge comes by the exercise of pure reason or intellect or thought alone, by itself, not aided by any empirical information or observation. It's just a matter of thinking. That's probably the most standard, I guess, traditional way of thinking about it, is that the a priori is something you arrive at by reason alone. But there's another proposal. It's that there is a kind of an experience that we have in connection with a priori knowledge. It's a kind of intellectual experience. It's not a sense experience. It's the intellectual experience of recognizing that something's true. George Beeler calls this an intellectual seeming, and he describes it as intuition. So sometimes when people use the word intuition, they're using it to talk about a kind of an intellectual experience you have when you recognize an a priori truth. So you can imagine reflecting upon some facts about the nature of a triangle, and then recognizing that the internal angles got to add up to no more than 180 degrees, and that might be something you just see. You have this intellectual seeming. You have an intuition to that effect. So 2 proposals about where the a priori knowledge comes from are that it's just the exercise of pure reason alone unaided, or that there might be a kind of experience which some people might want to call an intuition, which we have, whereby we just see or have an insight, and we realize that something, recognize that something is the case. Some of the claims that we take to be a priori seem to be things that we know especially well. So you might think that a priori knowledge is going to be the kind of knowledge that we know with certainty. And a posteriori, you might think, will be the kind of knowledge we don't know with certainty because it's just based on sense experience. So that's one thought. One thought is that a priori knowledge is especially secure, is especially well sort of, it's highly certain. It's the kind of knowledge that you could not show to be mistaken. It's indefeasible. That's one possibility. In fact, there would be a certain number of purported a priori truths where it might seem plausible that these things are known much better than anything else, and so they're certain. But Limos points out that you don't actually have to connect up the a priori with certainty in this way. There might be some cases in which our grounds for a belief, or for a belief that happens to be true and so constitutes knowledge, might be a priori, but that the a priori grounds are not strong enough for us to say that we know that a priori claim with certainty. So you might have a priori knowledge that isn't certain. And equally, you might have a priori grounds for a belief, and so be justified in the belief a priori, and yet the belief is false. Right? You might have good a priori grounds and you're wrong. The belief is false. So it could be a priori justified but false. So it wouldn't be perhaps certain. Certainly it would be defeasible. So though it's kind of attractive or intuitive to think that certainty and the a priori are connected up, the very idea of having a priori grounds for something doesn't require that a priori knowledge or a priori justification be certain. Here's a qualification that needs to be made. A priori knowledge is knowledge that is independent of experience. It's justified in a way that does not require experience. You know something a priori, not by experience. But it is still possible for an individual to acquire an item of a priori knowledge in a non-a priori way. Right? When I'm thinking now of a squared plus b squared equals c squared, Pythagoras' theorem. You could imagine, in fact, I think the first time I was taught this theorem, I was simply told the theorem. I heard the theorem. So there was an experience I had by which I acquired knowledge of the theorem. So I heard from a teacher about this theorem. So I acquired knowledge of Pythagoras' theorem. I knew Pythagoras' theorem in some sense, but I picked that up in an a posteriori way. I learned it empirically by means of experience. But that doesn't mean that that theorem is known by means of experience. It's going to have an a priori ground for it. It's a theorem for which the proof is not going to be a posteriori. It's going to be a priori. So it's possible that you might actually acquire an element of knowledge that in principle should be shown to be the case a priori, but you pick it up a posteriori because you're told about it, though you don't actually know how the thing is proven. You just acquire from somebody else by testimony some claim which can and should be known a priori, whose status is an a priori claim because it's not one that can be shown in an empirical way to be true, but you could acquire it. Another qualification about the a priori is not the same as being innate. To know something a priori is to have grounds for it, to justify it in a way that does not involve experience. It's a matter for debate whether there are any things that we know innately. I think in current thought, it's perhaps there are people who are going to think that we have some innate abilities, capacities to acquire knowledge that are sort of built into us by our makeup, but that we probably don't have substantive claims that constitute knowledge that we know in an innate way. But the thought is that being born with some beliefs is not the same as knowing them a priori. It might be that if we had some innate knowledge, we would know it a priori, but being born with it is not the same thing as knowing a proposition to be true independently of experience just by thinking about it, right? So the innate and a priori are not the same thing. They can at least be distinguished as concepts. You might want to run the argument, run the line that everything that's known a priori is something that's available to us innately, but you needn't. They're not the same notion. Now, I've been talking about the a priori versus the a posteriori. I hope the distinction is clear, that the a priori requires that we know the a priori truth not by means of experience, and we know a posteriori truth by means of experience. I want to now remind you of two other distinctions which they're not the same as, but they go along with the a priori, a posteriori distinction. And it's an interesting philosophical question what the relationship is, and as we'll see, there are a number of different ways of connecting these up. So the first distinction I want to remind you of is the analytic-synthetic distinction. That's the distinction between statements, some of which are true by virtue of meaning alone, and others are true by virtue of sort of the way the world is. An analytic statement is true by meaning. It's a conceptual truth. It's true by virtue of what the words that make it up mean. A synthetic statement isn't true by virtue merely of what its words mean, but it's true by virtue of there being some fact, for example, that is the case, right? So the analytic-synthetic distinction is a distinction between those statements that are true by virtue of the meaning of the words and those that are not. And then there's another distinction, the distinction between contingent and necessary truths. Contingent truths are truths that might have been false. Right? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 15 students here today, right? That could have been 20. It could have been 10. Right? It's contingent how many students are in class today. That's a contingent fact. Contingent facts contrast with necessary truths. A necessary truth is one that could not have been otherwise. So we've got the analytic, the synthetic, the contingent, the necessary, the a priori, and the a posteriori. Traditionally, it's been thought that these three distinctions kind of work together in a certain sort of way. It's been thought that the a priori knowledge goes along with, is associated with, statements that are true by meaning, analytic statements, and truths that are necessary. By contrast, it's been thought that a posteriori knowledge is knowledge of statements that are synthetic and which are contingent. Right? This is a kind of a traditional connection, a traditional association that's been made. We'll see in a moment that that's sometimes been rejected, but there's a kind of a standard way of connecting these things up. So here's an example. Consider the sentence that all vixens are female. By definition, a vixen is a female fox. That means it's an analytic truth. Right? It's an analytic truth that a vixen is female because it's a matter of the meaning of the word vixen. So it's an analytic truth when I say all vixens are female. You work out what vixen means and you'll realize that a vixen must be female because a vixen just is a female fox. But it's also going to be necessary that a vixen is female because if a vixen couldn't fail to be female, it wouldn't be a vixen. It'd be a male fox or something else all entirely different, right? Vixen's going to have to be female in order to be a vixen. So it's necessary. And you don't need any experience. You don't need to make an observation to determine the truth of the claim that all vixens are female. This isn't something that we need experience for. this is something we can know a priori, right? So here we have an analytic claim. There's a necessary truth about the things that are vixens, and we know it a priori. So here we have analyticity, necessity, and a prioricity going together. All vixens are female, contrast with there are no vixens in this room, right? If there was one, I think we'd see it scurrying out the door, right? Would not be happy to be in a lecture theater, listen to me talking about philosophy. So we assume it would be trying to get out of the place. But that's a synthetic claim, right? The claim there are no vixens in the lecture theater is a synthetic claim. It's made true by the way the world is, not by the meaning of the word vixen. It's also contingent. There could have been a vixen in here. It's a contingent truth. It's not necessary. And we know it by experience. We don't reflect upon whether there's a vixen in the room and work this out just by pure thought alone. It takes experience to know that there's not a vixen in the room. So what we have here is something that's a posteriori. So here we have a synthetic statement, contingent claim, known by experience, a posteriori. So again, we have this kind of way in which these claims tend to go together. A lot of a priori truths that we know without experience, independently of experience, are actually analytic. A lot of them are. Some philosophers have held that the only kind of necessary and a priori truths that there are analytic truths, right? Some philosophers have had the theory that the only kind of a priori knowledge there is this knowledge of claims that are necessary and analytic. The major modern view that defended that view were the logical positivists. Their view was that analytic truths are simply something that depends upon our language, that we have these linguistic conventions, and analyticity is restricted to matters of meaning, matters of the way we've chosen to use words, that analyticity generates necessity. That's the only kind of necessity there is, just sort of dependent upon the meanings of the words we have. And this is the only kind of thing that we can know a priori. But that's not a universally held view. So the classic view that I've just been describing, which has the analytic, the necessary, and the a priori on one side, and the a posteriori, and the contingent, and the synthetic on the other, that's been challenged. Right? Philosophers have rejected this, or there are philosophers who have rejected this. So there are philosophers who think, who have held, that there are things that we can know a priori that aren't just analytic. That we can have a priori knowledge where it isn't just a matter of working out the meaning of some claim, right? That we're not restricted in a priori knowledge to claims like all vixens are female and all bachelors are unmarried men. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. First example is well before the logical positivists. It's Immanuel Kant and the idea that we might know some synthetic claims, not just analytic, some synthetic claims to be true a priori. And then much more recently, Saul Kripke's idea that there are some contingent truths that can be known a priori. So say something about the synthetic a priori. Right, so these are claims that are not mere truths of meaning. An analytic claim is one that is true in virtue of the meaning of the words that are used to make up the statement. Synthetic statements are not like that. They depend upon something outside of the meaning of the words, something beyond the meaning of the words. Synthetic claims are not just conceptual truths. The claim that there can be synthetic a priori truths, that there are some of these claims that are not just conceptual, not just analytic, can be known by pure thought alone. They can be known a priori. Here's one example that's a fairly standard example. It's the claim that nothing can be both red and green all over. And the thought is that mere reflection on the concept of redness is not going to show you that something that's red couldn't be green as well. You might challenge that thought, but this is, think about the concept of redness. It's going to be the concept of a particular color, and that concept doesn't tell you that it couldn't also be green. It's not part of the concept of redness, so it's not analytic that something cannot be both red and green all over. Thought is that it's a synthetic claim that something cannot be both red and green all over. And yet, in a sense, you don't need to conduct an experiment. You don't need to make an observation to determine whether it's true that something can't be red and green all over. This is something you know without experience. Independently of experience, you know it a priori. You know independently of experience that something can't be red and green all over. It's a synthetic claim that you know a priori. Kant tried to get the synthetic a priori to do deep epistemological work, and he had some important principles that he thought under were the basis for scientific knowledge, which were synthetic a priori. And one example of a principle is the principle of causality. All events have a cause. He thought that that was a principle that is synthetic, right? It's not just a matter of the meaning of the words, and yet is known by pure thought alone. So a synthetic a priori. Kant thought that there were some principles that underlie knowledge, scientific knowledge, which were known a priori, even though they were not analytic. They were not true simply by virtue of the meaning of the words involved in their statement. They were synthetic claims. So he thinks there are some claims about the world that aren't just entailed by the meaning of the words that make up the claims, that we nevertheless are able to know, not by experience, but by thought alone. Right? That's the idea of the synthetic a priori. So that's one way of rejecting the classic view. Here's another. This is a set of views that are really quite widespread now. They were revolutionary when Kripke proposed them. We find them now in a book of his called Naming and Necessity, which is a set of lectures he gave. And Kripke argues that there are actually some necessary truths that we can know a posteriori. There are some necessary truths that, in a sense, we arrive at empirically. A couple of examples. Kripke thinks that water is necessarily H2O. Now, you have to find out that water is H2O. That's empirical. But given that you find out what water is, you find out that it's H2O, Kripke thinks that once you found that out, it turns out that you found out that the essence of water is to be H2O. There isn't any possible world in what we would call water is not H2O. Given that in every possible world water will be H2O, water is necessarily H2O. He thought that this was a necessary truth that we can find out ultimately by experience. So it's a necessary truth that's known a posteriori. Or take this podium. He was talking about a table. It happens to be made of wood. We have to find that out. He said it couldn't possibly be made of ice. This table couldn't possibly be made of ice. There could be another table that is made of ice, but this very table could not be made of ice. So it's a necessary truth that this very table is not made of ice, but that's something we find out about a posteriori. So Kripke thought there were some necessary truths that we're able to find out about effectively by observation. They're a posteriori necessary. But for our purposes, it's his claim that there are some contingent claims that we know a priori. Remember, it's a contingent claim. How many? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 15 students here today. That's contingent. It could have been otherwise. He thinks there are some contingent claims that can be known a priori. Normally, you'd think contingent claims have to be found out about a posteriori. in the same way that I had to count people here today. I had to look. You think that contingent claims have to be found out by observation. He thinks that there are some contingent claims that are known a priori. And his example is the standard meter stick. What then is the epistemological status of the statement, stick S is 1 meter long at T0, T0, for someone who has fixed the metric system by reference to stick X? It would seem that he knows it a priori. For if he used stick S to fix the reference of the term 1 meter, then as a result of this kind of definition, he knows automatically, without further investigation, that S is 1 meter long. On the other hand, even if S is used as the standard of a meter, the metaphysical status of S is 1 meter long will be that of a contingent statement. Under appropriate stresses and strains, heatings and coolings, S would have had a length other than 1 meter even at T0. So in this sense, there are contingent a priori truths. And that is something that is a kind of interesting rejection of the classic way of thinking about things, that there are some contingent facts that can be known a priori. Now, traditionally, philosophers have tended to hold that there are some things that we can know a priori. So it's a fairly traditional view in philosophy that a priori knowledge is possible. When you look at Descartes, somebody like Descartes who is a rationalist hold that a great deal of knowledge is basically a priori. In fact, Descartes tends to privilege the a priori over the straight empirical. If you look at Hume, Hume distinguishes between relationships between ideas and matters of fact, and he seems to allow that we can know matters that are relations of ideas in an a priori way. Kant thought that we know some synthetic claims a priori, so he thought we have a priori knowledge. Kripke thinks that there are contingent claims that can be known a priori. So there's a lot of agreement that there can be knowledge a priori. I want to look at a couple of cases of philosophers who try to reject the idea of a priori knowledge. The first is a view that I don't think people take too seriously nowadays. It's the view of John Stuart Mill, a 19th century empiricist and utilitarian. And John Stuart Mill thought of mathematical knowledge as being empirical. That view, at least his specific version of it, seems to be quite widely rejected. But in recent philosophy, the last 30, 40, 50 years or so, there's been a strong naturalistic movement, and philosophers, especially those influenced by Willard Van Orman Quine, have tended to reject the a priori. These are naturalists, and they're going to be the kind of philosopher who thinks that there isn't any a priori knowledge, or if there is, it's extraordinarily limited. So I'll say something about a paper by Michael Devitt called There Is No A Priori, which is in the Reader. But first, Mill. So Mill is defending a strong empiricist view. Most empiricist views are going to be empiricist about knowledge of the external world, but allow that there is going to be knowledge that isn't just by experience. So that would be Hume's relations of ideas, or it would be the positivist's idea that there are certain analytic truths that can be known a priori. But Mill seems to have been even more empiricist than the rest of them, thinking that you could be an empiricist about those things which many people have thought were known a priori, namely mathematical claims. He thought mathematical claims were basically empirical claims. So truths of arithmetic are basically going to be the result of inductive inferences. They're going to be extremely well-confirmed empirical claims. We think of truths of arithmetic as being universal and necessary. Well, it's because they're so well established. They're empirical claims that are so well established that we think that they're universal and necessary. And if Mill's right, then mathematical knowledge isn't fundamentally different from ordinary empirical knowledge from an epistemological point of view, right? You just use experience to get it. Nor is it going to be different from knowledge of the natural sciences. You just use observation to arrive at mathematical knowledge. So for somebody like Mill, the mathematical truth 7 plus 5 equals 2 is not known a priori. It's an inductive generalization. It's basically based on repeated observation of what happens when you combine 7 things with 5 things. Combine 7 apples with 5 oranges, or I've got 5 apples with 7 oranges, and you get 12 fruit, right? More generally, you combine 7 things of one kind as 5 other things, and you get 12. You build up the basis for an inductive generalization. That in general, when you combine 7 things with 5 things, you get 12 things. It's an inductive generalization based on experience. Just like the claim that all ravens are black, based on all the black ravens you've seen. Every time you combine 7 things with 5 things, you got 12 things. So it's an empirical claim. Now, this view has been pretty widely rejected. The basic problem with it is thinking of 5 plus 7 equals 12 as being an empirical claim along the lines of all ravens are black. So with all ravens are black, if you see a white raven, you reject the claim that all ravens are black. If the mathematical truth, the claim 7 plus 5 equals 12 is an empirical claim, then if we put 7 things and 5 things together and we don't get 12, we get 11, that would be evidence against the claim, right? If it's an empirical claim, then we could reject it in light of experience. If 7 plus 5 equals 12 is an empirical claim about the world, then if we get some evidence against it, we'll reject it, okay? But ask yourself, what will you do if you put 7 things together with 5 things and you get 11, not 12? Well, you're not going to conclude that 5 plus 7 doesn't equal 12. And you're not going to conclude that 5 plus 7 equals 12 most of the time. What you're going to do is you're going to look for an explanation for why when you stuck 5 things with 7 things you didn't get 12 things. Maybe one of the things you stuck with the other disappeared, vaporized, got lost. Or maybe 2 of the things joined to be 1, right? So maybe 2 things became 1. Or maybe you miscounted, right? You're going to explain away. If you put 5 things together with 7 things and get 11, you're going to look for an explanation and you're going to explain it away. You're not going to treat that claim that 5 plus 7 equals 12 as an empirical generalization which can be refuted based on experience. And this is why people are going to tend to think that a claim like that isn't an empirical claim. It's not an empirical claim because we don't treat it the way we treat empirical claims. Empirical claims we test, and if they fail the test, we reject them. The thought is 5 plus 7 equals 12 is not a claim like that. We're not going to reject it. We're going to reject the evidence against it. So a lot of people reject Mill's approach to the idea that mathematical claims are empirical generalizations. They think that's implausible. But naturalism as a contemporary philosophical movement, don't like the a priori. They either radically reject it or they just give it almost no role at all. It tends to be a movement that favors the empirical as the source of all knowledge, but in particular, philosophical knowledge. It's thought that philosophy is not fundamentally different from the sciences. And so that philosophical knowledge is basically, in some sense, empirical, ultimately empirical. Now, we'll be looking at naturalism in the next lecture, and often over the next few weeks, we'll be seeing naturalism as I look at a number of different issues in epistemology. But for the naturalist, mathematics, and this is like Mill, is not fundamentally different from any other area of knowledge. I'll be drawing here on Michael Devitt's paper, There Is No A Priori. Devitt thinks that we simply don't need to have, or you don't have to postulate the existence of a priori knowledge. We're not forced to admit that there is a priori knowledge. He thinks that the view that there is knowledge that's arrived at a posteriori, empirical knowledge, he thinks that's uncontroversial. We all accept that. But he says it's deeply obscure what a priori knowledge is, where it comes from, what its basis is. And he thinks that we may be able to explain where knowledge in mathematics and logic, or how it actually is empirical after all. And given that a priori knowledge, the notion of a priori knowledge is obscure, and that we could actually explain how mathematics and logic isn't a priori or how it's empirical, the best explanation is not that mathematics and logic are known a priori, but that, in some sense, they're empirical. Now, we saw that the objection to Mill is that we don't treat 5 plus 7 equals 12 as like an empirical generalization. We don't reject it if we put 5 items with 7 items and get 11. We treat the mathematical claim as not the kind of thing that can be refuted by that sort of experience. So we don't treat 5 plus 7 equals 12 as like all swans are white. All swans are white can be refuted by coming up with one black swan. That shows that all swans aren't white. You put 5 plus 7 together and get 11 items. The thought is that doesn't refute the claim that 5 plus 7 equals 12. It shows you counted wrong, or the things you put together, somehow you lost one of them. Devitt says is the mistake in looking at Mill and rejecting this conception of mathematical knowledge is to think of confirmation in the wrong way. Devitt thinks that if we regard our rejection of Mill as a reason to think that mathematics and logic can't fundamentally be empirical or a posteriori, we're thinking about the relationship between evidence and claims about the world, confirmation, in the wrong way. We're thinking about them in a non-holistic way, in an atomic way. And his thought is that we need to understand that when we have evidence for some claim, confirmation, the relationship between evidence and the views that we're going to accept based on the evidence, that confirmation is holistic. Here's Devitt. The key to the naturalistic alternative is breaking free of the naive picture of justification suggested by the swan example. Right? The swan example is all swans are white. Here's a black swan. Therefore, all swans aren't white. Right? That's a naive picture of justification. We must view justification in a more holistic way. Beliefs, vaguely coherentist, right? Remember I talked about coherentism and holism. Beliefs, even whole theories, do not face the tribunal of experience alone, but in the company of auxiliary theories, background assumptions, and the like. Much evidence for this Duhem-Quine thesis has been produced by the movement of philosophy of science inspired by Kuhn. In light of this, we have no reason to believe that whereas scientific laws, which are uncontroversially empirical, are confirmed in the holistic way, the laws of logic and mathematics are not. No reason to believe that there is a principled basis for drawing a line between what can be known this way and what cannot. So his thought is, if you adopt a holist view about the nature of confirmation, then you're not going to distinguish fundamentally between mathematics and logic and other areas of knowledge. So we're not going to think that mathematics and logic are justified a priori, whereas scientific knowledge and ordinary empirical knowledge are justified by appeal to our senses. The view is that logic and mathematics are just part of our system of beliefs. We take them for granted, but in principle, we might have to revise them. If we have to adjust our belief system radically in light of certain kind of experiences, one thing we might have to do is to modify our logic and our mathematical theories. So that's leading into naturalism. Devitt's rejection of the a priori reflects his naturalized approach to epistemology. I'll talk about that next time. Quine was a very influential figure. He developed something called epistemology. He had an article called Epistemology Naturalized. We'll look briefly at Hilary Kornbluth's appeal to Darwin in trying to explain how our belief-forming processes are ultimately to be, how we've arrived at reliable belief-forming processes as a result of evolution. And we'll look at a solution to the problem of induction that argues for a reliabilist approach to induction. So we'll be looking at naturalism in the next lecture. We've got time for questions. Justin and Nick. Sorry.
Where the no a priori Devitt argument seems to me weakest is the language side of things. Because, all right, logic, you can make claims about logic and maths and say that, you know, if you've made statements about what 1 + 1 or whatever. But that runs into difficulties where you talk about, you know, a bachelor is an unmarried man. That goes to the meaning of words. You're not going to redefine things unless you specifically change the language.
And
language itself is the framework under which you
so for the holist, everything's up for grabs. And I mean, so if you work with a Quinean picture where you have a sort of a big system of beliefs, and at the sort of outskirts of the system of beliefs, that's where experience is impinging on our beliefs. Most of our belief changes will just be in direct reaction to what we've observed. And the thought is that sometimes we may actually have to make quite far-reaching changes, and in principle, you might have to change analytic claims. The thought is that the analytic, logic, and mathematics are in the inside of our system of beliefs, and they're kind of protected from change. They're at the core. But the thought is that some of these things could, in principle, change. That's the view. That's the holist view, that everything is up for grabs. It doesn't mean that everything's really fundamentally up for grabs all the time, right? But it means that one of the things that you might consider is a change at the very inside of your belief system. May not happen. Quine thinks it's kind of largely on pragmatic grounds. But Devitt's thought is really confirmation is holistic, and in principle, you might revise some of these things.
But it's a change of a different character, isn't it? If I say...
Yeah, it is, but
because language is something I inherently agree with you.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we're not talking the same language.
Quine rejected the analytic-synthetic distinction, so he didn't think there was a difference between truths of meaning and truths of mere fact. So, and those people who think there's a strong distinction between analytic and synthetic might be able to resist this. But Quine certainly, part of his holism was actually rejecting the distinction between truths of meaning and truths of fact. Nick? Well, that's better than the beginning where you asked for give one and you wanted two.
What book is John Stuart Mill writing about? Logicon? So yeah, in what book does he make that point?
I don't know. I could find out. I suspect it's in a book called Logic, but basically you'll find it discussed when you look for an example of an inductivist philosophy of mathematics.
No, they never quoted it. Like I was reading like AJA's Truth, Language, and Logic.
Right.
It for like 3 pages, but he never actually references it. And same with like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
I think it probably is a book called The Logic, but I've got a book on Mill's philosophy in my room that I check, and I didn't bother to get a quote. This is one of those things that's sort of well known, but nobody ever goes into it. You wonder whether, in fact, Mill might have had some nuances that people haven't. Second question? I can't remember.
No, don't worry.
Anybody else?
This might be a really stupid question.
No.
Is there any real difference between an analytic claim and just a tautology?
Okay. So a tautology might be something like P or not P. Either this is a cup or it's not a cup. And those are thought to be sort of true. The contradiction has to be false because both it's P and not P, that can't be right, but it's either going to be a cup or not a cup. That's a tautology. Tautologies and analytic claims are going to have in common that they have to be true. Analytic claims are ones where there is a kind of a meaning component that's being exploited, like all vixens are female. You might think that the tautology is true sort of syntactically, P or not P. It doesn't matter what the P is, it's just a matter of that structure, that it's got to be true. P or not P, for any P, it's going to be true. I'm wondering, I mean, some people might see a closer connection. They might think either that all tautologies are analytic. I guess they probably think that. That wouldn't be, the thing is that analytic claims I'm thinking of is actually part of the meaning of the P that gets you the second bit. All bachelors are unmarried men. It's the meaning of the bachelor that gets you the unmarried men. So with the P or not P, it's nothing to do with the meaning of the P. So it looks like they share in common that they have to be true, and there might be a closer connection. But it looks like I would be saying that tautologies are sort of, it's a matter of syntax, they have to be true. Whereas with the analytic claims, it's as a matter of the meaning of the constituent term that they have to be true. There might be some other connections, but that's my off-the-cuff way of thinking about it. Okay, with no other questions, then next week will be naturalism, then I'm going to talk about truth, and we're going to be going beyond the book, and we're going to be looking at the issues of realism for the next couple weeks.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's what I don't get, because language is a participatory thing by definition, surely.
No, they wouldn't have to deny that.
I mean, if I say something and it's not intelligible at all, I mean, I'm not engaging in language. So whatever I think the meaning must be, I have to communicate in a common shared meaning, which presumably means it can't be changed as easily as well, in the same way as other truths can be changed.
Now, Quine was actually critical of meaning.
Right.
He didn't just think, he wasn't just against the analytic synthetic. He thought that there was, he talked about the radical indeterminacy of translation. So he was, but Devitt is less critical of, he's not a complete, he doesn't completely reject meaning in the way Quine would have. But that's part of what's at issue, is Quine's actually, part of his holism, or connected with his holism, is an attack on things like meaning.
Okay.
And you know, he thought that they're fundamentally the analytic synthetic distinction couldn't be sustained.
Right.
And I think that does lie at the base of his holism. I mean, you could probably be a holist without it, but
yeah, okay.
Certainly.
But for Quine itself, meaning is definitely in
Quine's
context.
rejecting the analytic synthetic distinction. He's rejecting. Is quite critical of notions of meaning, and that does tie up with his holism. And I think it's part and parcel of this claim that there's no fundamental difference between truths of meaning and truths of fact that gets the holism.
Yeah.
Because if there isn't, then, you know, if there were that distinction, then some things would be true by meaning no matter what, and some things would be true as a matter of fact.
No matter what.
But he thinks there's not that sharp distinction, so it's all connected.
Right.
And so in principle, empirical information can lead us to change our conceptual scheme. And that does fit with the history of science, because concepts are constantly changing historically as part of you know, as a theory or thing.
Yeah, okay. Yes, all right, so it comes up.
You got